Hi there, a very good evening to you. You're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive here in the Sky News Centre. It's time to see what's making headlines tonight with Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at ConservativeHome, and the Independent's political correspondent, Zoe Grunewald. Nice to have you both on the programme tonight. Thanks for joining us. They'll be with us from now just before midnight tonight. So let's have a look at what's on those front pages coming into us right now. Let's start with the FT. The front page says the working day for MPs hits a record low under Rishi Sunak. The front of the Eye says there's growing anxiety in number 10 as angry Tories question the Prime Minister's authority. And The Guardian reports that Tories are urging Rishi Sunak to give back a further £5 million from Frank Hester after the donor made alleged racist comments about Diane Abbott. On to the Daily Mail. It reports that Russia jammed the GPS system on Defence Secretary Grant Shapps' RAF jet, triggering a major security alert as it flew over the Baltic Sea. Onto the front of the Times, official data shows 20,000 people each month are off work with poor mental health. Paramedics are growing concerned about the prospect of electric ambulances, saying they'll delay response times. That's according to the Daily Telegraph. The Express leads on a victory for Esther Rantzen as MPs will stage a debate on the legalisation of assisted dying. Onto the Metro, its front page tomorrow morning looks a little like this. Reports on the millions of people negatively impacted by Britain's air traffic control system last year. Remember that? Because of its staff working from home, it says. And the Daily Star reports that NASA has found molecules of alcohol in the solar system. Now, a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us tonight. And as a reminder for you tonight, we're joined by Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at ConservativeHome, and the Independent's political correspondent, Zoe Grunewald. Good to see you both this evening. Thanks so much. Right, so let's start with the front page of the Eye newspaper. Why not? Pretty grim reading for Rishi Sunak, if he's got the papers as quickly as we have here on Sky News tonight. Number 10 anxiety grows as angry Tories question Sunak authority. There's been a lot going on, hasn't there, for the Prime Minister this week. Zoe, do you want to take this away? What do you make of this?
Yeah, so this comes on the back of Sunak earlier denying that there would be an early May election. So he ruled out May 2nd, which was the date that was kind of flying around Westminster a lot this week. And the reason it's been flying around is because it just seems like every week the Conservatives' prospects seem to get worse and worse. There's always a new political row. There's always a new mess that somebody has made, whether it's MPs defecting to other parties, whether it's the Prime Minister saying the wrong thing in the House of Commons, whether it's the leaking of their new extremism definition beforehand and then MPs not being very happy with the results. So what you see here is reporting of MPs basically just at their wits' end, very frustrated, wondering if Sunak actually can turn around their prospects at an election. And I think there is, you know, a real split down the Conservative MPs. Half want to see them go long. They think that things could change over the summer, the economy could pick up. The other half, I think it could only get worse. There's lots of things that could get worse over the summer. You could see more small boats crossings, more people renewing their mortgages, more political catastrophes. So what we have here is a real split in the Conservative Party over what Sunak should do.
OK, this is also in the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Let's have a look at that while we continue the conversation. Sunak stamping out talk of a general election on May the 2nd. Of course, we broke that here on Sky News as well with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, in the last hour or so. Henry, let's bring you in here now. I mean, from your contacts and the people that you talk to within the Conservative Party, does this paint a fair picture? And what are your thoughts about May the 2nd being categorically ruled out by the Prime Minister today?
It never seemed likely that Rishi Sunak would go for a May election. Nothing about him and the way he's governed and the way he is as a politician suggests that he wouldn't take an extra 6 months.
Some people were betting on it.
If they were available. Well, I mean, that's how bookies make their money, ultimately. If everyone got the bets right, there wouldn't be a gambling industry. It would have been better for the party to have a May election because May is the local elections and as it stands, based on where the Tories are in the polls, they are going to lose hundreds of councillors. And that means that those are all activists that they won't have at the general election. Local councillors are increasingly every party's activist base. They're the ones who go out and knock on the doors. So from the party's perspective, would have been better to go in May. Also, as Zoe said, there is a widespread view that there are more downside risks for the next 6 months, an extra 6 months, than gains. You know, maybe the economy will improve a bit, but if you were judging things on the last year, there's a greater chance that something else goes badly wrong. You'll have crossings. There's a chance there's another NHS crisis. More local councils could go bankrupt and catch fire and all the rest of it. So there are huge risks. And it is interesting, the mood shift being described in the Eye, because...
Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, but to an extent, because there is a general sense, I think, that most Conservatives think that the next election is not winnable. There's a question of how badly you lose. Maybe you can fight Labour closer than people think. And this loops back into why some of them are angry about the delay. If you're actively mishandling political stories in the way that Downing Street is at the moment, if you're sort of failing to call out a very obvious racist statement as racist, to pick a hypothetical example, then that just means that that next 6 months becomes a certainty of problems, right? If you've got a deft Prime Minister, he's doing some things that maybe you like, maybe he's laying some traps for Labour, maybe you think, OK, 6 months, whatever. But if you're looking at the Downing Street operation and you genuinely don't think that it has what it takes to handle difficult stories and crises, then you're going to think it's all risk hanging on till November.
Right, OK, let's move on to the Financial Times. Another big political story that it says it's uncovered. This is from the FT Investigates, or an analysis at the very least, that they have found working hours for Commons hits a record low under Rishi Sunak. They claim the working day for MPs in the House of Commons chamber has been shorter on average this parliamentary session than any other in the past quarter of a century, according to an FT analysis. Zoe, what do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I work in the House of Commons as a journalist in the lobby, and you can really feel this. They seem to clock off before we do. And I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just business in the chamber that MPs are undertaking. They're also doing their constituency duties. And then, of course, they have things like select committees. They have, backbench business. They have plenty of meetings. So it's not like all MPs just go home at 4 o'clock every day. But you can really feel that there's a dearth of legislation and a dearth of policy with this particular government. And this, I'm sorry to bring it back to the election, but is one of the most convincing arguments, I think, genuinely, for having a May election, is that this isn't a government or a Prime Minister that has a great deal of ideas, which would be fine if the country didn't have a great deal of problems, but it does. And I think what we're seeing is the Commons clocking off early, very little vision from Rishi Sunak, very little leadership. The Conservative Party conference, his offering was basically a smoke-free generation and maths to A-level, which is not... It doesn't really deal with the huge problems, some of which Henry said out earlier, that we're dealing with, bankrupt councils, NHS waiting lists, cost of living crisis. And really, with the kind of state the country's in, you would expect Parliament to be sitting, legislation to be passed, plenty of debates, plenty of scrutiny around policy. And really, the only big piece of legislation we've had recently is the Rwanda bill. OK. I just want to add, actually, before we move on, that they've said that they're sitting for 7 hours a day, 7 hours and 9 minutes a day, which is a record low since New Labour came into power, and they're sitting over 9 hours. Some people might think that's still quite a lot. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute, because I want to move on, while we've still got time, to the front page of The Guardian and some foreign news now. This is, of course, coming from the United States. The US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, very, very powerful politician, as we know, labelling the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as an obstacle to peace. And he's now calling for fresh elections in Israel. What's your take on this, Henry?
Whatever you think of Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's a very divisive politician, I don't think this is the kind of thing America should be engaging in, telling another democratic country, when to hold its own elections. Fundamentally, Israel's government is Israel's business. It is a war government that includes parties from most of the Israeli Knesset, I think, at this point. It is, I think the analysis is perhaps true to an extent. The kind of perennial problem with Netanyahu in recent years is basically that if he leaves office, he's going to be prosecuted for a lot of things. But he keeps managing to get back into the Prime Minister's office, which means that he's then immune. It also means he has no incentive to step down. So he will cling on for as long as he can. So is Netanyahu a barrier to peace? Potentially, but I think we shouldn't overestimate his individual role. There are a lot of right-wingers in the Israeli parliament who are just as committed to his policy as he is. But
it's stark that Chuck Schumer, who's been a huge supporter of Israel, is now saying this. The White House apparently heard about his speech in advance, necessarily endorsing it, but not saying he can't say it. So what is your take on it? Well,
I think, it's worth pointing out that there's people living in Israel who support Israel's right to exist but don't agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's policies and really, really object to what's going on in Gaza at the minute. I don't think that's an uncommon or a particularly controversial view. I think it would take most people a lot to look at the scenes coming out of Palestine and not be heartbroken by them. So I think what you're seeing now is quite interesting. It does seem like a real turning of the mood, where people are questioning the Israeli Prime Minister's approach to this conflict, and wondering if really there is ever going to be an end to peace if you have a leader who, you know, rules out a two-state solution, who refuses to kind of engage, and if actually a more diplomatic leader who represents the will of most of the people in Israel would be much more helpful.
OK, one final look at the front page of the Daily Mail before we have to go to our break. Really interesting story, this. Russia attacks Shap's RAF jet by jamming GPS. It's, of course, talking about the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps potentially being in a very dangerous situation in mid-flight. Tell us a bit more about it, Henry.
Well, I mean, basically, he was flying near to Kaliningrad, which is a bit of what used to be Germany that Russia randomly owns after World War II, and he got his plane lost access to GPS. Now, that's not the end of the world. It's not as if they actively attacked the plane's electronics or avionics. It wasn't going to fall out of the sky, but it did mean that it suddenly didn't know where it was in relation to the global flight network. Now, it doesn't say here whether or not this was a deliberate targeted attack. Been suggested outside this room that actually it's just that Russia has this kind of blanket policy in its airspace, and maybe he was flying too close to it. But it's a reminder of the kind of thing that happens if we were to end up fighting Russia. We would be in all kinds of difficult situations like that.
OK, Henry and Zoe, thank you very much. Plenty more from both of you in just a couple of minutes' time. In the meantime, we're going to have a look at more of the top stories on the front pages, including the front of The Guardian, saying Tories are urging Rishi Sunak to give back a further £5 million donation from Frank Hester. Of course, that story has been rolling all week. Plenty more on that after this short break. We'll see you in a moment. Hi there, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with you once again, Henry Hill and Zoe Grunewald. Good to see you this evening. Let's start by having a look at the front page of the Guardian, excuse me. Tories urged to give back a further £5 million from Hester. Of course, Hester is Frank Hester, whose comments about Diane Abbott have been condemned as racist and misogynist this week. He's reported to have donated £10 million. This is an extra £5 million they found. Zoe, do you want to take this one away?
Sure. So on top of the £10 million that's already been discussed quite a bit this week, it's now been revealed that the Conservative Party is sitting on a further £5 million. So the reason they're sitting on it is because previously we knew how much Mr Hester had donated from the Electoral Commission records, but they have not been declared yet. They're sort of released at the end of the year. So this is a bit of, you know, good old-fashioned journalism, finding out that the Conservatives are indeed sat on another donation from Hester. This just brings this whole row back into, you know, into the picture, because what are they going to do with this now? Now, I think, you know, there's a reasonable argument that the £10 million before maybe was already pledged, it was spent, it was accepted, and it was declared without knowing the comments that Mr Hester had made. But when we know that they are now, you know, in receipt of this £5 million, deciding whether or not to declare it, deciding whether or not to pledge it, it really is a question about, you know, how much does that money mean to you, and are you willing to say you will not take this man's donations because of the racist comments he made about Diane Abbott? OK, we believe it would have been declared, just not published yet. Is that correct? And we'll find out in the next Electoral Commission update of nations due in early June, as you mentioned. What's your position on this? Would you say, Henry, what would the Conservative Home position be? Do you think they should give the money back? Can they afford to give the money back?
My position is not the Conservative Home position, just have to... I'm not speaking ex cathedra. But I think they've managed to mishandle this, because personally I think you can keep the donation, because they didn't know at the time that they accepted the money, right? And generally, I take a fairly dim view of anyone being asked to endlessly return donations. They took the money in good faith.
Even though he's been condemned as a...
but it's not... But they didn't take it when they knew he had those views, and presumably they haven't pledged it to a £10 million racism and misogyny fund, right? So I think that's fine. I think they can then take no more of his money and disassociate themselves, but I don't think they should necessarily have to give it back. But what's remarkable about this is that you could still have just called him out and said it was racist. And I think that what's really baffling to me about this story is when I first heard it breaking, and I heard that ministers were umming and ahhing about whether or not, and then I read what he said, and I was like, this is one of the most, like, obviously racist comments that we've had in ages, right? It's not ambiguous at all. So they could, I think, have staunched the bleeding. There would still have been some anger, but they could have staunched the bleeding if they just said, look, we took this money in good faith, this is unacceptable, it is racist, and we're not taking any more. But instead, this story is running and running because they haven't managed to draw that line.
OK, let's just squeeze in one more if we can. Onto the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Fears for patients at NHS net zero drive. Apparently, ambulances could become electric, at least some of them, and there are concerns about delayed response times. Zoe, what do you think of this?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, one of those real kind of policy issues, which is that we have a lot of pressure on the NHS at the minute, a lot of concern about how money is being spent, if it's being spent well. And we also have concerns increasingly, or the politicisation of net zero. And you have the two come together here to basically say that the push for net zero may further affect the issues that people are experiencing when they interact with the NHS. So the concern here is that these electric ambulances, with all the costs of recharging them, with all of that, will increase delays, will make it more expensive. And I think there are some legitimate concerns here. I don't think we are fully equipped in this country for the demands that will be placed on the grid when we try and electrify all our cars. However, I don't think that's a good reason to give up. I think the net zero targets are incredibly important. They're not just important for us, but our international obligations too.
We need to leave it there. Zoe, thanks very much. Henry, thanks to you too. You're going to stay where you are, and we'll be back with you in the next hour.